How would you put food on the table if you lost your job? Everyone in the nation knew your face, and your reputation was ruined beyond repair. After an alcohol-fueled, off-duty beating of an African-American man who happens to be the son of a Supreme Court judge, the two cops are terminated from the force and must survive in a society that they are blacklisted from by entering the world of crime. Chapter 1. A Night to Remember. The Firkin local pub was alive with a familiar, boisterous energy, its warm amber lighting casting shadows over polished wood floors and walls adorned with vintage Guinness advertisements. The scent of spilled beer mingled with the aroma of fried pub fare, creating a comforting, lived-in smell that welcomed its patrons. A Celtic melody played from a small band in the corner, the fiddle's high notes weaving through the hum of conversation and laughter. At the heart of the commotion was a table draped with a lopsided banner that read, "Happy 30th, Sammy." The off-duty officers gathered there had already ordered several rounds, their laughter growing louder as the night wore on. Sammy, a wiry white man with sandy brown hair and a perpetual smirk, was at the center of it all, reveling in the attention. Behind the bar, Kendra, the bar manager, leaned against the counter with a practiced nonchalance. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, from the waitress gracefully balancing a tray of shots to the old man nursing a pint at the end of the bar. Kendra, a black woman in her late 30s, had a striking presence. Her braided hair pulled into a high bun and her lips painted in a bold crimson shade. She was as much a fixture of the pub as its well-worn bar stools. The waitress, a young woman with radiant dark skin and a confident stride, wove through the crowd with ease, her presence commanding admiration from more than a few patrons. Her hair, a halo of natural curls, caught the dim light, giving her an almost ethereal glow. She flashed a practiced smile as she delivered drinks, her movements fluid and precise. "Old man, they sure know how to have a good time, don't they?" Kendra: "They'll be all right." Old man: "Why's that?" Kendra: "They're the cops." The man's eyes widened slightly before he turned back to his drink, muttering, "Old man, oh." Just then, the door swung open, letting in a gust of cool night air. Ethan Brooks stepped inside, his tall frame and confident stride turning a few heads. His light brown hair was neatly combed, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room with the focus of someone used to assessing his surroundings. Dressed in a dark leather jacket over a fitted shirt and jeans, he exuded a relaxed confidence that bordered on cockiness. His gaze landed on Cynthia, and a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Cynthia stood casually at the bar, her deep brown skin glowing under the amber lights. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes met his, a spark of recognition passing between them. She was dressed simply but stylishly in a fitted top and jeans that highlighted her athletic build. Her black shoulder-length hair framed her face, and her posture radiated self-assuredness. Ethan made his way toward her, weaving through the throng with ease. Ethan claps a hand on the birthday boy's shoulder. Ethan: "Happy birthday, Sammy!" Sammy responds with a grateful smile. Sammy: "Thanks, man. Where's your partner?" Ethan smirked, the corners of his mouth curling upward in that familiar, roguish way. Ethan: "In prison." A beat of confusion passed before Ethan added, "Ethan, sorry, I mean at home with his wife." The table erupted in laughter, the tension breaking as Ethan's charm worked its magic. He turned to Cynthia, his smile softening. "Ethan, ladies, how's the night treating you?" Cynthia rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the small laugh that escaped her. She gave Ethan a playful punch on the shoulder before pulling him into a brief hug. Cynthia: "Better now that you're here to entertain us." Beside her, Jolie, Cynthia's best friend and roommate, raised an eyebrow. Jolie's bronze complexion and striking features turned heads wherever she went, and her jet-black hair was styled in loose waves that framed her face. Her dark eyes sparkled with mischief as she regarded Ethan. Jolie: "Hello, Ethan. Didn't expect to see you here." Her tone was cool, but the subtle curve of her lips hinted at a shared history she wasn't ready to bring into the spotlight. Ethan hesitated, the momentary flicker of unease in his eyes betraying his otherwise easy demeanor. Ethan: "Hello, Jolie. It's been a while." Jolie leaned back, her smile growing sly. Jolie: "It has. How are you holding up?" Ethan gave a short laugh, motioning for the waitress to bring over a tray. Ethan: better with some shots in my system. As the night wore on, the energy in the pub grew even more frenetic. Ethan found himself pulled into a dance with two waitresses, their laughter ringing out as they spun around him. Across the room, Cynthia watched, her jaw tightening with a flicker of annoyance. She threw back another shot and turned to Sammy and Jolie. "Cynthia, let's dance." Her tone left no room for argument. On the dance floor, Cynthia's movements were sharp and deliberate, her frustration bleeding into every step. She leaned toward Jolie, her voice low. "Cynthia, look at him, making a damn fool of himself." Jolie smirked, her gaze following Ethan. "Jolie, an ass you're probably going home with tonight." Cynthia shot her friend a sharp look, but Jolie only laughed, her voice light and teasing. "Jolie, girl, don't trip. He's not even going to remember tonight." Cynthia turned back to the dance floor, her jaw tightening as she resolved to forget her irritation in the sway of the music. Chapter 2. Lines Crossed. Ethan's apartment was dimly lit, the golden glow of a solitary lamp casting long shadows across the small living room. The walls were sparsely decorated, save for a few framed photos of his academy days and a battered bookshelf laden with true crime novels and case files. The hum of the city beyond his window was a constant, muted backdrop, blending with the faint creak of his old couch as he slouched into its worn cushions. Ethan himself cut an imposing figure even in this moment of solitude. His light brown hair was slightly disheveled, and the deep lines of exhaustion under his sharp blue eyes hinted at the long hours and weighty decisions that defined his job. He tugged at his loosened tie, undoing the last button of his dress shirt to reveal the faint outline of a tattoo on his collarbone. A relic from his military days, a chapter of his life that few people knew in detail. He downed a glass of water, the cool liquid doing little to erase the effects of the night's excesses. He was reaching for the remote when a loud, insistent knock shattered the quiet. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing as he stood. Visitors were rare this late. As he opened the door, the sight of Cynthia took him aback. Cynthia stood there, her presence filling the doorway like a storm about to break. Her deep brown skin seemed to shimmer under the dim hallway light, her flushed cheeks betraying the emotions simmering just beneath the surface. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes were blazing with intensity, framed by her loose, shoulder-length curls that had begun to frizz slightly from the night's humidity. She was Afro-Latina, and her mixed heritage was apparent in her sharp, high cheekbones and the soft fullness of her lips, now pressed into a tense line. "Sin," Ethan started, but before he could finish, she stepped inside, pushing the door shut behind her with a definitive click. She moved closer, and the faint scent of her perfume, a blend of jasmine and something spicy, filled the air between them. "What?" Ethan tried again, but Cynthia didn't let him finish. Her hands grabbed his shirt, pulling him toward her with a force that left no room for hesitation. Their lips collided in a fiery kiss that carried all the frustration, anger, and unresolved tension between them. "Did you really have to act like that tonight?" she hissed between kisses, her voice low and charged. The sharpness of her words contrasted with the heat of her actions, creating a whirlwind that Ethan found both disarming and irresistible. Ethan managed a breathless, "What?" before her lips silenced him again, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss was urgent, almost desperate as they stumbled toward the couch, shedding jackets and inhibitions along the way. Cynthia's nails grazed against the faint stubble on his jaw, her touch as electrifying as her presence. The room seemed to shrink around them, the hum of the city outside fading into the background as the tension between them reached its breaking point. When they finally collapsed onto the couch, tangled in each other's arms, the air was thick with the unspoken weight of what had just transpired. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Cynthia lay with her head resting on Ethan's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Then, without lifting her head, she broke the silence. "Are you going to apologize?" she asked, her voice quieter now but still tinged with the teasing edge she often used to disarm him. Ethan turned his head to look at her, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "For what?" Her response was a mischievous smile as her hand darted toward his side, finding a ticklish spot that made him yelp in surprise. Her laugh, warm and genuine, filled the room, momentarily dispelling the tension. But as the laughter faded, so did the lightness. They lay in silence, the weight of their shared history and the complexity of their relationship pressing down on them. Ethan's gaze drifted to the ceiling, his thoughts swirling with questions he didn't dare voice. Cynthia, meanwhile, closed her eyes, willing herself to forget the vulnerability she had just shown. The night stretched on, the quiet punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak of the old couch beneath them. Neither of them wanted to move, knowing that once they did, the fragile peace of the moment would shatter. Chapter 3. The morning after. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft stripes of light across the rumpled sheets and the two figures sprawled across Ethan's bed. The alarm clock on the nightstand blared an obnoxious tone, breaking the serene quiet. Groaning. Ethan groaned, his arm fumbling to silence the noise, while Cynthia buried her face deeper into the pillow. Groaning. "What is that, some girl calling you?" Smiling, eyes still closed. "It's an alarm, not a ringtone. We should get up." Cynthia let out a muffled groan but rolled onto her back, blinking at the ceiling. Teasing. "You're wearing my badge." Cynthia rolled her eyes, sitting up and snatching the badge from his hand. "Lucky for you, I'm off duty today. Otherwise, I'd write you up for being a pain in the ass." Ethan chuckled, leaning back against the headboard. "You'd have to catch me first." The playful banter filled the room with a surprising lightness, but underneath it, an unspoken tension lingered. Cynthia's gaze lingered on the sunlight peeking through the blinds. She sighed softly, as though bracing herself for the shift back to reality. As Cynthia began gathering her clothes, Ethan watched her with a mix of admiration and uncertainty. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city outside. "Ethan, sin last night." She cut him off with a small, wry smile. "Cynthia, don't ruin it, Brooks." Her tone was light, but there was an edge of finality to her words. Ethan nodded, leaning back against the bed frame as she walked toward the bathroom. The sound of the water running filled the air, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He stared at the ceiling, the weight of his unspoken feelings settling heavily on his chest. The morning stretched on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. As Cynthia stepped out of the bathroom, fully dressed and composed, she offered Ethan a brief smile. "Cynthia, see you at the precinct." Ethan watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her. The room felt colder without her presence, and he let out a long, slow breath, already dreading the unspoken tension that awaited them at work. Chapter 4. Ripples of Consequences. The usual morning buzz is accompanied by the shuffle of chairs and the low hum of officers exchanging notes on recent cases. The briefing room, with its stark fluorescent lighting and rows of mismatched desks, carries the smell of stale coffee and paper. Lieutenant O'Brien stands at the front, his presence commanding despite his casual stance. A tall, broad-shouldered white man with graying temples and sharp blue eyes, O'Brien exudes the authority of someone who had seen it all and taken no nonsense along the way. His crisp uniform is immaculate, the brass on his badge gleaming under the artificial light. Ethan slides into his seat just as O'Brien's voice cuts through the chatter. "O'Brien? All right, listen up. We've got a surge in car thefts over in the West District. Pattern suggests a chop shop might be in play, so keep your eyes open. And remember, it's not about being a hero. It's about keeping the peace." The room quiets as O'Brien's gaze sweeps across the officers. He nods toward Sammy, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "O'Brien, and before I forget, belated happy birthday to Officer Jackson. I trust you had a responsible celebration." Laughter ripples through the room as Sammy holds up his coffee cup in mock toast. As the briefing ends and chairs scrape against the tiled floor, O'Brien motions for Ethan to stay behind. "O'Brien." "Brooks, a word." Ethan approaches the desk, his heart racing slightly as O'Brien hands him an envelope. The lieutenant's face remains impassive, though there is a flicker of pride in his eyes. "O'Brien, Major Rickman dropped this off this morning." With a steady hand, Ethan opens the envelope. His eyes scan the letter inside, the words confirming what he'd hoped for. He'd aced his detective exam and was now under consideration for the position. The weight of the achievement settles over him, but so does a gnawing sense of unease. Recent choices, both personal and professional, loom large in his mind. "O'Brien, good work. But remember, the brass will be watching. Stay sharp, Brooks." Ethan nods, pocketing the letter. Ethan. Thanks, Lieutenant. I won't let you down. O'Brien gives him a curt nod before turning back to the next officer needing his attention, leaving Ethan to navigate the mingled pride and uncertainty of the moment. The patrol car hummed quietly as Ethan flipped through his notebook, the pages filled with scrawled notes and case updates. Beside him, Sean leaned back in his seat, one hand draped lazily over the steering wheel. Sean, a white man in his late 40s, had the rugged look of someone who had spent too much time in the sun and too little caring about sunscreen. His short-cropped hair was peppered with gray, and his sharp green eyes carried a permanent glint of cynicism. His uniform, while technically regulation, always seemed slightly askew, his tie loosened and his badge scratched from years of use. The silence between them was thick, filled only by the crackle of the radio as mundane updates filtered through. Sean's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, a sign of his restlessness. Sean broke the silence first. Sean, you know I've been thinking about this detective thing of yours, climbing the ladder, huh? Ethan glanced at him, unsure whether the comment was praise or something else. Ethan, that's the plan. Sean's lips curled into a smirk, his tone laced with condescension. Sean, don't get cocky, kid. Up there it's all politics. Half the job's knowing whose toes not to step on. Ethan grinned, determined to keep the mood light. Ethan, good thing I've got you as my mentor. Diplomacy must be your strong suit. Sean chuckled dryly but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Ethan couldn't help but notice the tension in Sean's jaw, a silent testament to whatever was gnawing at him beneath the surface. Their radio crackled, breaking the moment. A voice announced a disturbance near the jewelry store they had scouted earlier. Radio voice, distorted. Disturbance near the jewelry store. Units respond. Ethan reached for the ignition. Ethan, guess we're on. Sean leaned forward, a sharp edge in his voice. Sean, let's hope it's not another false alarm. I hate wasting time. Ethan started the car, the low growl of the engine mirroring the unspoken tension that lingered between them. Chapter 6. Unseen Lines. Jason Watts stepped out of the pharmacy, clutching a small paper bag of medication. The parking lot was dimly lit, the overhead lamps casting long, flickering shadows across the cracked asphalt. Jason moved with a quiet confidence, despite the weariness etched into his features. A black man in his early 30s, Jason carried himself with the poise of someone who had been raised to believe the world was his to conquer. His dark brown skin gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light, his sharp cheekbones and neatly trimmed beard giving him a distinguished appearance. Jason's childhood had been one of privilege. Growing up in a leafy suburb, he'd had the support of both parents who ensured he never had to worry about where his next meal would come from or if the lights would stay on. His father, a successful attorney, and his mother, a college professor, had instilled in him the values of discipline and respect. Weekends were spent on family outings, piano lessons, and quiet dinners where intellectual debates were encouraged. Jason had known security and stability, but it had also made him acutely aware of how different his life was from others, a knowledge that came with its own burdens. Tonight, however, none of that mattered. Gloria's worsening fever was the only thing occupying his mind. The memory of her lying on the couch, her brow damp with sweat and her voice weak as she urged him to hurry, tightened his chest. He adjusted his coat against the chill, the cold biting through the layers, and quickened his pace toward his Lexus. As he crossed the lot, headlights illuminated his path. He paused briefly, his senses prickling as he noticed a patrol car idling nearby. Jason's jaw tightened. He recognized the feeling, the unspoken tension of being watched and judged. He shrugged it off, unwilling to let them see his discomfort. He climbed into his Lexus, the car's pristine condition a deliberate choice. It was more than just a mode of transport. It was a symbol of the life he had built, a life that demanded respect. Inside the patrol car, Ethan Brooks sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel as his eyes followed Jason's movements. Ethan's light brown hair was slightly tousled, his sharp blue eyes scanning the scene with a mix of unease and weariness. Ethan. He's clean, Ethan said after a beat, though his tone lacked conviction. Beside him, Sean leaned forward, his fingers tapping impatiently against the door. Sean's rugged features were hardened by years on the force, but it was the bitterness in his green eyes that gave away his deeper struggles. A white man in his late 40s, Sean had grown up in a broken home. His mother had fled from his abusive father when Sean was just a boy, dragging him to a small, rundown apartment on the other side of town. Life had been a constant battle, scraping by on his mother's meager income, enduring the sneers of wealthier kids at school, and wrestling with a simmering anger he couldn't always control. Becoming a cop had been his way out, but it hadn't erased the resentment that had been instilled in him early on. "Sean, you sure about that? That car doesn't scream regular pharmacy run to me." Ethan sighed, his grip on the wheel tightening. "Ethan, we ran the plates. He's good. Let's not create a problem where there isn't one." Sean leaned back with a scowl, his jaw tightening as his fingers drummed against the armrest. "Sean, we're doing our job, Brooks. Following him isn't a crime." Ethan said nothing, the weight of Sean's words settling over him like a heavy fog. He shifted the car into gear, the patrol car rolling out to trail Jason's Lexus. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken conflict simmering beneath the surface. Ethan's stomach churned, a mix of anger and resignation brewing as he questioned how much longer he could ignore the lines being crossed. Jason glanced in his rearview mirror, his jaw tightening further as he noticed the patrol car following at a measured distance. His mind raced, torn between frustration and apprehension. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening as he willed himself to stay calm. The weight of his upbringing pressed against him in this moment, the knowledge that respectability wasn't always enough to shield him from suspicion. In the patrol car, Sean smirked, his green eyes narrowing as he watched Jason's taillights. "Sean, let's see where Mr. Clean is headed," Sean muttered, his tone laced with condescension. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched as guilt gnawed at him. He wanted to push back, to argue, but the weight of Sean's seniority and his own internal conflict kept him silent. The car hummed quietly as they followed Jason onto the main road, the distance between them a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Chapter 7: Collision Course. The dark road stretched ahead, the hum of tires on asphalt blending with the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Jason Watts gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening as he glanced at the rearview mirror. The patrol car behind him was a shadowy reminder of everything his father had warned him about. Being a black man in an expensive car, driving through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. His chest tightened as the weight of those warnings bore down on him, each one a ghostly echo of past conversations. Jason's heart raced, but he forced himself to focus on the road. Gloria needed him. The bag of medication on the passenger seat felt heavier than it should, its presence a lifeline and an anchor. He whispered under his breath, "Just stay calm. Don't give them a reason." Behind him, Ethan Brooks sat rigid in the patrol car, his hands gripping the wheel as though it might keep the situation from spiraling. His sharp blue eyes flicked from the road to his partner, Sean, whose demeanor had shifted into something sharper, more volatile. Sean leaned forward, his green eyes narrowing as he watched Jason's Lexus. The tension in the car was palpable, Ethan's unease clashing with Sean's growing aggression. Sean's voice broke the silence. "He's up to something. You can't tell me a guy like that isn't hiding something." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We've already checked him. Plates are clean. He's done nothing wrong." Sean scoffed, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "You don't get it, do you? Guys like him think they can get away with anything." The words stung, but Ethan swallowed his retort. Sean's bitterness was rooted in his past, a childhood marred by poverty and an abusive father who had lashed out at anyone who threatened his fragile sense of control. Sean had grown up watching his mother scrape by on minimum wage, her resilience a stark contrast to the anger and hopelessness that had consumed his father. It had shaped Sean, hardening him in ways Ethan couldn't fully understand. The patrol car suddenly surged forward, bumping Jason's rear bumper. The impact jolted Jason forward, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced, every nerve on edge as he guided his car to the side of the road. He turned off the engine, his hands trembling as he reached for the steering wheel. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the tension crackling like static in the air. Sean stepped out of the patrol car, his movements purposeful and tense. The flashlight in his hand cut through the darkness, the beam landing squarely on Jason's face as he approached. Sean said, "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Jason rolled down the window, forcing himself to remain calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked. Sean's expression hardened. "Step out," he repeated. Jason hesitated, glancing at the patrol car where Ethan stood by the passenger side, his eyes avoiding both Jason and Sean. Jason exhaled slowly, his heart pounding as he opened the door and stepped out. He raised his hand slightly, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I don't understand, I wasn't speeding. What's this about?" Sean ignored the question, his flashlight sweeping over the interior of Jason's car. His jaw tightened as his gaze landed on the bag in the passenger seat. "What's in the bag?" he asked. Jason frowned, his patience thinning. "Medication, for my fiancée." Sean stepped closer, his posture radiating suspicion. "Mind if we take a look?" Jason straightened, his voice firm. "Yes, I do. I know my rights." The tension snapped taut between them, each second stretching into an eternity. Sean's eyes flashed with something dark, frustration, anger, or perhaps a need to assert control. He moved to open the car door and Jason instinctively stepped forward, his movements quick but defensive. Ethan shouted, "Wait!" but it was too late. Sean swung his arm, his firearm catching Jason across the temple. Jason staggered, his vision blurring as pain seared through his skull. "Don't!" Jason's voice broke as he raised his arms in a desperate attempt to defend himself. His movements were uncoordinated, a mix of fear and survival instinct. Sean struck again, this time sending Jason crumpling to the ground, unconscious. Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "What the hell, Sean?" His voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Sean stood over Jason's motionless form, his breathing heavy as he wiped his brow. "He went for my gun." Sean's voice was cold and detached. Ethan's stomach churned, the words slicing through him like a blade. He stared at his partner, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. In the distance, red and blue lights flickered, their approach a haunting reminder that this night would not end quietly. "Jesus," Ethan muttered under his breath, his hands trembling as he looked at Jason's still body. The reality of what had just happened sank in, each second dragging him deeper into a pit of guilt and helplessness. Chapter 8. The Fallout. The morning news cycle churned with relentless intensity, plastering the incident across every screen. Headlines screamed phrases like "Young man hospitalized after officer encounter." Clips of Jason Watts being wheeled into Bay Ridge Hospital played on a loop, interspersed with shaky cell phone footage that captured the chaotic aftermath. The images were haunting. Jason's unconscious body on a stretcher, the flashing red and blue lights painting the scene in stark contrast, and bystanders' horrified faces etched with disbelief. At the precinct, the air was suffocating. The usual camaraderie was replaced by strained silence. Officers avoided eye contact, their conversations reduced to murmurs as if the walls themselves were listening. Ethan Brooks sat in the locker room, his shoulders hunched and his head bowed. The metallic tang of sweat and the faint scent of cleaning supplies filled the room, but Ethan barely noticed. His badge sat in his lap, its polished surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a cruel reminder of the weight it now carried. His chest felt heavy, his breath shallow as guilt clawed at him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jason's face contorted in pain, and Sean's cold, detached expression. The voice in his head was relentless. "You should have stopped him. You could have done something." The door creaked open, and Lieutenant O'Brien entered, his expression as grim as the mood permeating the precinct. A tall, broad-shouldered man, O'Brien's usual air of calm authority was cracking. His jaw was tight, and the lines on his face seemed deeper. "Lieutenant O'Brien Brooks, my office, now." Ethan rose slowly, his legs feeling like lead. He followed O'Brien down the corridor, the walk feeling interminable. The precinct, usually alive with the hum of activity, felt like a tomb. Every glance thrown his way felt like an accusation, every whispered conversation a condemnation. Ethan's stomach churned as he passed by familiar faces, their eyes quickly darting away. Inside the office, O'Brien shut the door with a definitive click and gestured for Ethan to sit. The room, usually a neutral space filled with neat stacks of files and commendation plaques, felt oppressive. O'Brien leaned forward on his desk, his piercing blue eyes boring into Ethan. "Lieutenant O'Brien, what the hell happened out there?" O'Brien demanded, his voice low but brimming with controlled anger. O'Brien's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening further. "Lieutenant O'Brien, and you let it happen?" The question hit Ethan like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain the impossible position he'd been in, but the words failed him. "Ethan Brooks, I didn't know how far it would go," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. O'Brien leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply as he ran a hand over his face. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. "Lieutenant O'Brien, do you understand the kind of firestorm we're dealing with? The Watts family isn't just any family, Brooks. Jason's father is Judge John Watts, and his brother is a high-profile attorney. The media is already swarming, and the department is neck-deep in damage control." Ethan's stomach churned violently. He knew the Watts name carried weight, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it all the more real. He could already picture the headlines, the protests, the relentless scrutiny. "Lieutenant O'Brien, you and Sean are on administrative leave effective immediately. Hand in your badge and firearm." The words struck Ethan like a hammer. His hands trembled as he reached for his badge, the act feeling like tearing off a piece of himself. He placed it on the desk, the familiar weight leaving his hand but not his conscience. His firearm followed, its cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of shame flooding through him. O'Brien's gaze softened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "Lieutenant O'Brien, Brooks, I know you're not a bad cop, but right now it doesn't matter what you are. Public perception is everything. You need to lawyer up and prepare for the worst." Ethan nodded numbly, his mind a whirlwind of regret and dread. As he left the office, the weight of the stares and whispers bore down on him like a physical force. The precinct he had once viewed as a sanctuary now felt like a prison, every corner echoing with his mistakes. For the first time in his career, Ethan wasn't sure he could see a way forward. Chapter 9. The Watts Family. At Bay Ridge Hospital, the Watts family gathered in the sterile glow of Jason's room. The space was quiet save for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the muted hum of fluorescent lights. Despite the clinical setting, the room exuded an air of quiet dignity, a reflection of the family that occupied it. Gloria sat by Jason's bedside, her hands gripping his limp one as though her touch could will him back to consciousness. Her eyes, rimmed red from sleepless nights, flicked to his face every few moments, searching for any sign of movement. Her dark brown skin glowed faintly under the harsh lighting, her features drawn with exhaustion but still strikingly beautiful. The weight of helplessness pressed down on her, heavier with each passing second. Judge John Watts stood by the window, his tall, commanding frame silhouetted against the city lights. His graying hair was perfectly combed, and his tailored suit, though wrinkled from hours of wear, still spoke of prestige. John's face was a mask of controlled fury, his piercing eyes scanning the street below as if searching for answers in the darkness. Years spent on the bench had taught him the importance of composure, but tonight, his restraint was fraying. "John, have they updated his condition?" Gloria looks up, her voice trembling. "Gloria, all we know is he's stable, but he hasn't woken up yet." The door opens and Alan Watts enters, filling the room with his presence. The door opened and Alan Watts entered, his presence instantly filling the room. Jason's older brother exuded the same elegance as their father, though his tailored navy suit was slightly rumpled and his tie had been loosened. Alan's features were sharp, his clean-shaven face and carefully styled hair giving him an air of precision and authority. His expression, however, was razor-sharp, his dark eyes gleaming with fury. "Alan, I just got off the phone with Senator Thompson. He's offering support, but he's also advising we push for immediate charges against the officers." John turns to face Alan, his jaw tightening. "John, what's the status of the investigation?" "Alan, they're dragging their feet. The department put the officers on leave, but that's it so far. They're hoping to ride this out." "John, not on my watch. We're not just going to push for charges. We're going to make this a landmark case." Gloria glances up at John, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Gloria, do you really think we can win?" John steps closer to Gloria, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "John, We don't just win, Gloria. We make sure this never happens again. Alan nods, his fists clenching at his sides. Alan, we'll mobilize every resource we have, media, legal teams, political connections. They won't know what hit them. The Watts family stood united in their grief and determination, their pain transformed into a righteous fury that would drive them forward. The room, once filled with despair, now buzzed with the electric charge of resolve. For Jason, for justice, and for every silent victim who had come before him, they would not rest until the truth was laid bare and accountability was demanded. Chapter 10. A Fractured Bond. Ethan Brooks sat on the edge of his couch, his apartment bathed in the dim, flickering light of the muted television. The screen displayed endless loops of news footage, headlines screaming about Jason Watts and the fallout of the incident. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the images, Jason's face, lifeless and bruised, as he was loaded onto a stretcher. Each loop of the broadcast chipped away at Ethan's fragile composure, the reality of his failure settling deeper into his chest. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, a sharp intrusion in the oppressive quiet. For a moment, Ethan considered ignoring it, the weight of guilt making every interaction feel unbearable. But when he saw Cynthia's name on the screen, he snatched it up, his voice cracking as he answered, "Ethan, hey, Cynthia, I saw the news. What the hell happened, Ethan?" Ethan exhaled shakily, his fingers gripping the phone tightly. "Ethan, it got out of control. Sean, he went too far. Cynthia, and you, what did you do? Ethan, I didn't stop it. I tried, but I didn't do enough." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan felt the chasm growing wider between them with every second. "Cynthia, do you even understand what this means? Jason could have died, Ethan. He still might not make it. Do you get that? Ethan, I know I messed up, Cynthia, don't. This isn't just about you messing up. It's about what this says about you, about us." Ethan's chest tightened. "Ethan, please, don't do this, Cynthia. Do you even see me? Do you understand what it's like for me, an Afro-Latino woman, watching this unfold? Every time I step outside, I wonder if someone like Sean sees me as a threat. And now you're telling me you stood by and let it happen? How am I supposed to trust you?" Ethan tried to speak, but his throat closed up. He had never considered how deeply Cynthia's identity shaped her view of the world, how the quiet, unspoken tensions had lingered between them, unaddressed but always present. "Cynthia, I don't know if I can be part of this. I need to think about where I stand, about us." The line went dead before Ethan could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, the stillness around him crushing in its weight. Outside, the distant hum of the city continued, indifferent to the fractured bond that had just unraveled within the walls of his apartment. Chapter 11. Legal Maneuvers. The Watts family's home stood as a testament to Black excellence, a sprawling estate nestled in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. The exterior, a blend of modern glass and historic brick, was adorned with manicured gardens and sculptures by renowned Black artists. Inside, the atmosphere radiated both prestige and warmth. Walls were lined with paintings from luminaries like Jacob Lawrence and Kehinde Wiley, their vibrant colors telling stories of struggle, triumph, and resilience. Shelves displayed intricate carvings from Ghana and Haiti, each piece a nod to the family's roots and pride in their heritage. The air carried a faint, rich aroma of aged wood and fresh flowers, curated weekly by a local Black florist. Judge John Watts had built this life brick by brick. Born into modest beginnings in the Deep South, he had clawed his way out of systemic barriers through sheer determination. As a young man, John excelled academically, earning scholarships that took him to Ivy League halls, where he often stood as one of the few Black faces in the room. His sharp intellect and unyielding resolve made him a force to be reckoned with. Over decades, he cultivated relationships with political figures, business leaders, and activists, leveraging every connection to amass influence. His knack for navigating complex systems while championing equity had earned him both respect and fear. Today, that same resolve simmered beneath his composed exterior as he sat at the far end of the polished oak conference table in the estate's library. The room, bathed in soft golden light from an elaborate chandelier, was both a workspace and a sanctuary. Bookshelves stretching from floor to ceiling held volumes on law, history, and civil rights, alongside framed photos of family milestones and portraits of trailblazing black figures. Alan Watts, his eldest son, sat at the head of the table, his posture commanding as he scanned the team of lawyers assembled before him. Alan, like his father, exuded a quiet authority. His tailored suit was immaculate, and his every movement spoke of precision. Around the table sat some of the brightest legal minds in the country, civil rights advocates, top-tier litigators, and media consultants, assembled to craft an ironclad strategy. Alan stepped forward, determination etched on his face. Alan. First, we press charges, not just against the officers involved, but against the department for fostering a culture of misconduct. Lawyer 1. We need to approach this carefully. The defense will argue that the officers were acting within protocol, especially since one of them claims Jason was reaching for a weapon. Alan. Jason doesn't own a weapon, and we're going to prove it. The fact that they're even floating that excuse is part of the problem. At the other end of the table, John leaned forward, his voice calm but steely. John, this case isn't just about Jason, it's about sending a message. We're going to shine a spotlight on systemic issues, and we're not backing down. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. John's voice carried the authority of a man who had fought battles and won wars in courtrooms and beyond. His presence alone was enough to galvanize those around him. Alan nodded and continued. Alan, we'll start with media outreach. Make sure Jason's story is told accurately and powerfully. We'll counteract any narrative that tries to paint him as anything other than the victim he is. Lawyer 2 spoke up, his tone measured but firm. Lawyer 2, we should also anticipate pushback from the police union. They'll rally their resources to discredit Jason and minimize the department's accountability. John's eyes narrowed, his determination evident. John, let them try. We'll be ready. They want to make this about Jason's actions that night? Fine. We'll make it about their policies, their training, their patterns of behavior. This isn't a one-off incident, and we all know it. Gloria entered quietly, carrying a tray of coffee and tea. Despite the weight of her grief, she moved with grace, her every action deliberate. She placed the tray on the table and lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting John's. John, thank you. The tension in his face softening momentarily. Gloria, do whatever it takes. This isn't just about us, it's about everyone who's been through this and didn't have a voice. Her words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the stakes. Alan straightened, his resolve deepening. Alan, we'll make sure of it. For hours, the Watts family and their team dissected every possible angle of the case, their collective expertise and determination creating a formidable force. The library, with its rich history and elegant decor, became a battleground for justice. Outside, the evening descended into night, the estate glowing softly under the stars, a beacon of resilience and defiance in a world that demanded both. Chapter 12. A Partner's Dilemma. Sean slumped heavily in his worn leather armchair, the amber liquid in his tumbler catching the faint light of the television. The living room was a study in shadows, illuminated only by the flickering images from the muted screen. Empty beer cans and crumpled receipts littered the coffee table, a testament to the chaos that had seeped into his life. The air was thick with the scent of stale alcohol and the faint musk of neglect. Sean's jaw tightened as he took another swig, the whiskey burning a bitter path down his throat. In the doorway, Claire stood silently, her arms crossed over a faded cardigan. Her presence carried a quiet intensity, her once striking features softened by time and the weight of a hard life. Claire had grown up in foster care, bouncing from one temporary home to another. Each transition chipped away at her hope for stability, leaving behind scars that no amount of time could truly heal. She had once dreamed of becoming someone important, someone whose name mattered, a journalist maybe, or an artist, but those dreams had faded under the relentless strain of survival. Meeting Sean had felt like finding an anchor. He wasn't a perfect man, far from it, but he offered a stability she had never known. His job, though grueling and often dark, put a roof over their heads and food on the table. In the beginning, there had even been flashes of kindness in him that made her believe he could be her safe haven. Yet, as years passed, the same stubbornness and anger that fueled Sean's work began to creep into their home, eroding the fragile trust between them. "Claire, you need to talk to someone, Sean. This is eating you alive." Sean's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Sean, talk to someone? About what? That I did my job? That some punk kid ended up in the hospital because he wouldn't listen?" Claire's brows knitted together, the lines on her face deepening. "Claire, is that what you really think? You think this was just about doing your job?" Sean shot up from the chair, the tumbler rattling against the coffee table as he slammed it down. "Sean, what else am I supposed to think, Claire, huh? You think I'm gonna sit here and say it was my fault? That I, what? Panicked? Made a mistake? That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works." Claire didn't flinch, her years of enduring Sean's outbursts giving her a resilience he couldn't shatter. She stepped closer, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. "Claire, Sean, I've seen this before. You're not the first person to bury what's killing them, but it's not gonna stay buried forever. And when it comes back up, it'll destroy you." Sean turned away, his broad shoulders heaving with the effort of holding back emotions he didn't know how to face. His stubbornness was a shield, forged in a childhood where admitting weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. The son of an angry, broken father who lashed out at the world and a mother who disappeared when life became too much, Sean had learned early to rely on no one. Authority became his sanctuary, control his weapon. But now, in this moment, even those defenses felt fragile. "Sean, it already has," Sean muttered, his voice barely audible. He sank back into the chair, his head falling into his hands. For the first time, the weight of what he'd done seemed to press visibly on him, but only for a fleeting moment. When he looked up again, the flicker of doubt was gone, replaced by the cold, defensive defiance that had carried him through his career. "Sean, you don't get it. People like him, they don't follow the rules. They push, and when you push back, you're the bad guy. But someone has to keep the line. Someone has to keep order." Claire's heart ached at his words, at the warped justifications he clung to. She saw through the bravado to the wounded man beneath, but she also knew that Sean's stubbornness was a wall she couldn't break on her own. "Claire, and what about me, Sean? What happens to us? You think your job, your anger isn't tearing us apart?" Sean didn't answer, his silence heavier than any argument. Claire lingered for a moment longer, her eyes searching his for something, remorse, vulnerability, anything. But when she turned and walked away, the room seemed to exhale with the weight of her departure. Left alone, Sean reached for the tumbler again, the whiskey his only solace in the suffocating quiet. The television flickered on, the images of protests and news anchors filling the void. Yet even as he stared at the screen, his mind drifted back to that dark road, to the moment everything had changed. And still, Sean couldn't bring himself to admit, even to the emptiness of his own home, that he bore any responsibility for what had happened. For Sean, guilt was a luxury, one he wasn't ready to afford. Chapter 13, The Community Speaks. Outside City Hall, the plaza teemed with life. Protesters filled every corner, their voices weaving a tapestry of anger, hope, and determination. Signs bearing bold slogans like "Justice for Jason" and "End Police Brutality" bobbed above the crowd, their messages cutting sharply through the crisp evening air. The distant hum of traffic was drowned out by the rhythmic chants of the demonstrators. The air felt thick, almost electric, charged by the collective grief and resolve of the community. At the center of the commotion, Gloria Watts stood at the podium. The warm glow of the streetlights haloed her figure, illuminating the quiet strength etched into her features. Her upbringing had been a study in contrasts. Born into an upper-middle-class family, Gloria had been raised in a home where dignity and perseverance were taught alongside table manners. Her parents, both educators, had instilled in her a profound sense of justice and compassion. They had often reminded her of her privilege and the responsibility it carried to speak for those who couldn't, to fight for what was right. Tonight, that sense of duty burned within her. Dressed in a simple black coat that shielded her from the autumn chill, Gloria gripped the edges of the podium as though steadying herself against the weight of her own emotions. Her dark brown skin, flawless despite the years, glowed softly under the stage lights. Her natural curls framed a face that was both weary and resolute. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of neighbors, activists, and strangers united by a shared purpose. When Gloria spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone unafraid to bare her soul. Gloria Watts, Jason is not just a statistic. He's a son, a brother, a fiancé, and he deserves justice. The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers swelling like a wave and crashing against the walls of the surrounding buildings. Gloria closed her eyes for a brief moment, grounding herself in their energy, their support. When she continued, her voice rose with a passion that commanded attention. Gloria Watts, for too long we have watched as our sons, our brothers, and our fathers are taken from us. For too long we have endured a system that sees black lives as expendable. But tonight we say enough. Tonight we stand together. Tonight we demand change. The crowd erupted once more, their chants echoing into the night. Tears slipped down Gloria's cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. They were a testament to her grief, her love, and her unyielding resolve. Among the crowd, Kendra from the Firkin stood silently, her arms crossed over her chest. Her usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by a mix of guilt and quiet determination. Kendra had always been good at brushing off the brashness of the officers who frequented her bar, their crude jokes and dismissive attitudes. She'd laugh politely, pour another drink, and tell herself it wasn't her problem. But now, watching Gloria speak with such raw vulnerability, Kendra felt the weight of her own complacency. As the chants grew louder, Kendra made a silent vow. She would do better. She would be vigilant, more aware. She would stand with her community and use her voice to support the fight for justice. The atmosphere around City Hall buzzed with urgency and hope. People of all ages and backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices united in a symphony of resistance. Young activists handed out water bottles and candles for the vigil planned later that night. Elders shared stories of past struggles, their wisdom a guiding light for the younger generation. The collective energy was infectious, inspiring, and unrelenting. As Gloria stepped away from the podium, a young woman in the crowd passed her a candle, its small flame flickering in the breeze. Gloria accepted it with a nod, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions within her. She turned back to the crowd, her voice carrying over the chants once more. Gloria Watts, this isn't just for Jason, this is for every life lost to injustice. This is for every voice silenced, and this is for the future we must build together. The crowd quieted momentarily, her words sinking in like seeds planted in fertile soil. Then, as if ignited by her resolve, their chants resumed, louder and more determined than before. Gloria stood among them, not just as a grieving mother, but as a symbol of their shared fight, her flame held high against the darkness. Chapter 14. A Slow Awakening. Ethan Brooks sat stiffly in the small, nondescript office of the precinct psychologist. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee, a clinical mix that only heightened his discomfort. The room itself was devoid of personality, save for a couple of framed certificates on the wall and a generic landscape painting above the desk. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, making every crack and blemish on the beige walls more pronounced. Ethan crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched as he avoided eye contact with Dr. Ross, who sat across from him with a quiet, steady demeanor. Dr. Ross, a woman in her early 60s, radiated an air of calm authority. Her piercing gray eyes seemed to see through every layer of his defenses. Her silver hair was swept back into a no-nonsense bun, and her tailored navy blazer gave her an almost intimidating presence. But it was her voice, soft yet firm, that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Ethan, she began, folding her hands neatly on her lap. "Tell me about that night." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. The familiar knot of guilt tightened in his chest. His foot tapped against the carpeted floor, a restless rhythm betraying his unease. "It wasn't supposed to go that way," he said, his voice low. "I knew Sean was on edge, but I thought I could manage him. I thought—" His voice faltered as the weight of his failure pressed down on him like a physical force. Dr. Ross studied him, her expression neutral but attentive. "You thought it wouldn't escalate," she said, finishing his thought. "And yet it did. Why do you think that happened?" Ethan's head snapped up, frustration flickering in his blue eyes. "Because I froze," he admitted, the words escaping like a confession. "I hesitated when I should have acted. I didn't stop him." "And why do you think you hesitated?" Dr. Ross asked, her tone unwavering. Ethan ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his fingers tugging at the strands as though trying to pull the answers from his own mind. "Because I didn't want to rock the boat," he said after a long pause. "Sean's been my partner for years. He was my friend." Dr. Ross leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Ethan, acknowledging that fear is a step forward, but you need to ask yourself, what kind of officer do you want to be? What kind of man?" Her words cut deep, lingering in his mind long after the session ended. Ethan stepped out into the cold evening air, pulling his coat tighter around him. The city seemed to hum with its own restless energy, the sounds of honking cars and distant sirens filling the night. His breath formed pale clouds in the air as he walked, his thoughts churning with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Ethan's life outside the precinct had taken a dark turn. With his suspension and mounting bills, he had turned to a side gig he once would have condemned. The job wasn't glamorous, playing muscle for a criminal organization that operated out of a dingy bar on the city's outskirts. It was a place reeking of spilled beer and desperation, where shadows seemed to cling to every corner. Ethan's imposing figure and military background made him an asset, but every time he stepped through those doors, a part of him felt like it died a little more. Tonight he leaned against the bar's graffiti-scrawled brick wall, watching the room with a practiced eye. The patrons were a mix of hardened criminals and desperate souls seeking solace in liquor. Smoke hung heavy in the air, curling around the flickering neon lights that buzzed intermittently. Ethan's hand rested on the butt of the concealed weapon at his side, a reminder of the violence that could erupt at any moment. A man approached him, short and wiry, with a face that looked like it had taken one too many hits. "Brooks," the man said, his voice a low growl. "We've got a problem. Some guy's in the back refusing to pay up. Boss wants you to handle it." Ethan nodded curtly, his jaw tightening. As he made his way through the dimly lit bar, his footsteps echoed on the sticky floor. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a simmering resentment toward the situation, toward himself. He pushed open the door to the back room where a scrawny man sat trembling, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent light. "You know the deal," Ethan said, his voice cold and detached. "Pay what you owe or things get messy." The man stammered, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his wallet. Ethan's stomach churned. He hated this, hated the way he had to harden himself to become a person he barely recognized. But he needed the money, and this was the only option left. When the ordeal was over, Ethan stepped outside, the crisp night air a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the bar. He lit a cigarette, the glow of the ember illuminating his weary face. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of it all, the guilt, the anger, the despair. Dr. Ross's words echoed in his mind. "What kind of man do you want to be?" Ethan exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes narrowing as he stared out at the city. He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing. The path he was on wasn't sustainable. Something had to change. Chapter 15. A Late Apology. The cheap motel room was bathed in the soft, golden glow of a flickering lamp on the nightstand. Ethan lay sprawled on the rumpled bed, his body half covered by a thin sheet. Beside him, a Latina escort stirred, her dark curls spilling over her bare shoulders. Her soft features and almond-shaped eyes bore an uncanny resemblance to Cynthia, a resemblance Ethan couldn't ignore when he hired her after his latest job in the underworld had left him with money to spare. Her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and spice, lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of cigarettes and cheap cologne. Ethan stared at the cracked ceiling, his mind a battlefield of guilt and longing. The woman beside him murmured something in her sleep, and he turned his head slightly to look at her. She wasn't Cynthia, and she never could be. But for a fleeting moment, she had filled the void he didn't want to acknowledge. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and pulled on his jeans. The motel carpet felt rough under his feet as he moved to the small window. Outside, the neon glow of a nearby diner sign cast shifting colors onto the empty parking lot. Ethan sighed deeply, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Sean was spiraling down his own dark path. The life he had once known was crumbling, his finances tightening to a stranglehold. His wife, Claire, had stopped asking questions about the overdue bills and their dwindling savings. Pride kept Sean from admitting the full extent of their troubles, but desperation finally drove him to call an old friend, a man with connections in the shadows of the city. It had been a tense meeting in a smoke-filled back room of a pool hall. The friend, a bulky man with a gravelly voice and a scar cutting through his eyebrow, had made it clear the work wasn't pretty, but it paid. And Sean, for all his bluster, wasn't in a position to be picky. Now Sean found himself standing guard outside a seedy club, his police badge swapped for the weight of a handgun tucked into his waistband. The night air was thick with the scent of sweat and spilled beer, and the muffled thud of bass from inside the club reverberated through his chest. Sean's green eyes scanned the crowd lining up at the door, his face set in a grim expression. He wasn't proud of where he had landed, but pride didn't pay the bills. Weeks later, Ethan stood outside Bay Ridge Hospital. The imposing building loomed over him, its bright lights a harsh contrast to the dimness that seemed to envelop his life. In his hand was a small bouquet of white lilies, their petals delicate against his calloused fingers. The thought of walking through those doors had haunted him for weeks, but his guilt had become an unbearable weight. Every day, Jason's face had haunted him, the fear in his eyes, the pain etched into his expression as Sean's actions spiraled out of control. Ethan couldn't erase the past, but the need to make things right for his conscience had finally driven him here. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The sterile smell of antiseptic immediately hit his senses, mingling with the faint hum of machinery and distant murmurs of hospital staff. The fluorescent lights were harsh, illuminating every scratch on the polished floors and every wrinkle in the tired faces of nurses passing by. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the long, quiet corridor as he approached the reception desk. Ethan. Jason Watts. The nurse at the desk glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and mild suspicion before giving him directions to Jason's room. Ethan nodded his thanks and began the walk, his heart pounding louder with each step. When he pushed the door open, the sight before him made his breath catch. Gloria was sitting by Jason's bedside, her hand gently resting on her son's. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her posture was straight, her presence commanding even in this vulnerable moment. Jason's face was pale but alert, his dark brown eyes half-lidded as he turned slowly to see who had entered. The beeping of the heart monitor punctuated the heavy silence in the room. Gloria's eyes widened when she saw Ethan, her lips pressing into a tight line. Her expression shifted from shock to simmering anger as she rose to her feet. "Gloria, you've got some nerve showing up here." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. He held out the bouquet awkwardly, unsure what else to do. "Ethan, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say I'm sorry." Jason's dark brown eyes locked onto Ethan's, his gaze unflinching. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "Jason, sorry doesn't change what happened." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of Jason's words pressing down on him. "Ethan, I know, but I need you to know that I'm trying to be better. I failed you that night and I'll carry that for the rest of my life." Gloria crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly but still guarded. Her voice, though quieter now, carried an edge of resolve. "Gloria, words are easy, Officer Brooks. Actions matter. Prove it." Ethan nodded again, his gaze never leaving Jason's. "Ethan, you're right, and I will." For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the faint hum of the hospital's ventilation system. Ethan placed the flowers on the small table by the bed and turned to leave, his chest tight with a mix of regret and determination. As he walked down the corridor and out into the cold night, He knew one thing. This was only the beginning of making amends. Chapter 16. The descent begins. Ethan had never imagined he would find himself in a place like this. His connection to Gerald came through a mutual acquaintance from the bar, a grizzled patron named Vic, who seemed to know everyone worth knowing in the city's underbelly. Vic had seen potential in Ethan, a sharpness honed by years on the force and a desperation that made him pliable. When Gerald needed new talent for a risky operation, Vic made the introduction, assuring Ethan it was a chance to rebuild his life for a price. The mechanic's shop was shrouded in shadows, illuminated only by a few flickering overhead lights. The air was thick with the acrid scent of oil and grease, and the faint hum of distant machinery provided a constant, uneasy backdrop. Ethan stood near the entrance, his nerves fraying as he glanced around the grimy space. This wasn't the world he'd envisioned for himself, but it was the one he now inhabited. The clang of tools echoed off the walls as Gerald's crew filed in, their heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor. Gerald stepped forward, his presence commanding. Tall and broad-shouldered, he exuded a quiet menace. His dark suit was impeccable, a stark contrast to the gritty surroundings, and his deep-set eyes seemed to see through every pretense. Around him, his men moved with practiced ease, their rough appearances betraying lives spent on the edge of the law. Terrence, Gerald's right-hand man, was a towering figure with a permanent scowl etched into his rugged face. His biceps strained against the fabric of his shirt as he adjusted his stance, casting an intimidating shadow. "Gerald, Ethan, welcome to the team. Let's see what you're made of." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. He felt the weight of Gerald's gaze as they walked deeper into the shop. A deal was going down tonight, his initiation into this world. Meanwhile, across town, Sean was planning a different kind of operation. His small apartment was dimly lit, the air stale from weeks of neglect. Sean sat at the cluttered kitchen table, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he reviewed the plan with his crew. The map in front of him detailed the layout of a drug house he'd gotten a tip about. 6 men inside and a safe rumored to hold enough cash to change their fortunes. "Sean, we hit fast, we hit hard, and we're out before they know what's happening. No mistakes." His crew nodded, their expressions grim. Among them was Bernie, a wiry man with quick hands and a sharper temper, and Lamont, whose size and strength made him invaluable in close quarters. The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of fear and determination as they prepared for what could be their biggest score, or their last. The drug house was a decrepit 2-story building on the edge of the city, its windows boarded up and its front porch sagging. The surrounding neighborhood was eerily quiet, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. Sean and his crew crouched behind a row of overgrown bushes, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The plan was simple. Bernie and Lamont would cover the back while Sean and another crew member, Curtis, entered through the front. Sean's heart pounded as he signaled the team to move. The creak of the porch steps under his boots was deafening, but no one inside seemed to notice. He raised his gun, motioning for Curtis to kick the door open. The wood splintered under the force and the room exploded into chaos. "Sean, nobody move!" The men inside hesitated, their hands slowly raising as Lamont and Bernie appeared from the back, weapons drawn. Curtis moved swiftly, emptying drawers and overturning furniture until he found the safe behind a false wall. "Curtis, got it!" Sean kept his gun trained on the occupants as Curtis worked the safe's combination. Time stretched agonizingly as the lock clicked open, revealing stacks of cash inside. Sean's breath hitched as he stared at the money, but he forced himself to stay focused. "Sean, bag it and let's move." The crew worked quickly, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Just as they were about to leave, one of the occupants made a move, reaching for a hidden gun. Bernie reacted instantly, firing a shot that dropped the man where he stood. The sound was deafening, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the room. "Sean, let's go!" They sprinted out the back door, the money heavy in their bags as they disappeared into the night. The getaway car roared down the empty streets. The crew's breathing labored as they processed what had just happened. Sean gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "Curtis, we're clear. Nobody's following." But Sean's gut told him otherwise. His fears were confirmed when flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. "Sean, shit!" The car tore through the streets, weaving recklessly as the sirens grew louder. Lamont loaded his weapon, his face grim. "Lamont, what's the plan, boss?" Sean's mind raced as he maneuvered through the labyrinth of the city. "Sean, we split up, lose the heat and meet back at the safe house." He veered sharply into an alley, the tires screeching as the car came to an abrupt halt. "Sean, go!" The crew scattered into the shadows, their breaths ragged as they disappeared into the night. Sean stayed behind, his pulse hammering in his ears as the officers approached. He knew he couldn't outrun them, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Chapter 16. The descent begins. Ethan had never imagined he would find himself in a place like this. His connection to Gerald came through a mutual acquaintance from the bar, a grizzled patron named Vic, who seemed to know everyone worth knowing in the city's underbelly. Vic had seen potential in Ethan, a sharpness honed by years on the force and a desperation that made him pliable. When Gerald needed new talent for a risky operation, Vic made the introduction, assuring Ethan it was a chance to rebuild his life for a price. The mechanic's shop was shrouded in shadows, illuminated only by a few flickering overhead lights. The air was thick with the acrid scent of oil and grease, and the faint hum of distant machinery provided a constant, uneasy backdrop. Ethan stood near the entrance, his nerves fraying as he glanced around the grimy space. This wasn't the world he'd envisioned for himself, but it was the one he now inhabited. The clang of tools echoed off the walls as Gerald's crew filed in, their heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor. Gerald stepped forward, his presence commanding. Tall and broad-shouldered, he exuded a quiet menace. His dark suit was impeccable, a stark contrast to the gritty surroundings, and his deep-set eyes seemed to see through every pretense. Around him, his men moved with practiced ease, their rough appearances betraying lives spent on the edge of the law. Terrence, Gerald's right-hand man, was a towering figure with a permanent scowl etched into his rugged face. His biceps strained against the fabric of his shirt as he adjusted his stance, casting an intimidating shadow. "Gerald, Ethan, welcome to the team. Let's see what you're made of." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. He felt the weight of Gerald's gaze as they walked deeper into the shop. A deal was going down tonight, his initiation into this world. Meanwhile, across town, Sean was planning a different kind of operation. His small apartment was dimly lit, the air stale from weeks of neglect. Sean sat at the cluttered kitchen table, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he reviewed the plan with his crew. The map in front of him detailed the layout of a drug house he'd gotten a tip about. 6 men inside and a safe rumored to hold enough cash to change their fortunes. "Sean, we hit fast, we hit hard, and we're out before they know what's happening. No mistakes." His crew nodded, their expressions grim. Among them was Bernie, a wiry man with quick hands and a sharper temper, and Lamont, whose size and strength made him invaluable in close quarters. The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of fear and determination as they prepared for what could be their biggest score, or their last. The drug house was a decrepit 2-story building on the edge of the city, its windows boarded up and its front porch sagging. The surrounding neighborhood was eerily quiet, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. Sean and his crew crouched behind a row of overgrown bushes, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The plan was simple. Bernie and Lamont would cover the back while Sean and another crew member, Curtis, entered through the front. Sean's heart pounded as he signaled the team to move. The creak of the porch steps under his boots was deafening, but no one inside seemed to notice. He raised his gun, motioning for Curtis to kick the door open. The wood splintered under the force and the room exploded into chaos. "Sean, nobody move!" The men inside hesitated, their hands slowly raising as Lamont and Bernie appeared from the back, weapons drawn. Curtis moved swiftly, emptying drawers and overturning furniture until he found the safe behind a false wall. "Curtis, got it!" Sean kept his gun trained on the occupants as Curtis worked the safe's combination. Time stretched agonizingly as the lock clicked open, revealing stacks of cash inside. Sean's breath hitched as he stared at the money, but he forced himself to stay focused. "Sean, bag it and let's move." The crew worked quickly, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Just as they were about to leave, one of the occupants made a move, reaching for a hidden gun. Bernie reacted instantly, firing a shot that dropped the man where he stood. The sound was deafening, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the room. Sean, let's go! They sprinted out the back door, the money heavy in their bags as they disappeared into the night. The getaway car roared down the empty streets. The crew's breathing labored as they processed what had just happened. Sean gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Curtis, we're clear. Nobody's following. But Sean's gut told him otherwise. His fears were confirmed when flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Sean, shit! The car tore through the streets, weaving recklessly as the sirens grew louder. Lamont loaded his weapon, his face grim. Lamont, what's the plan, boss? Sean's mind raced as he maneuvered through the labyrinth of the city. Sean, we split up, lose the heat and meet back at the safe house. He veered sharply into an alley, the tires screeching as the car came to an abrupt halt. Sean, go! The crew scattered into the shadows, their breaths ragged as they disappeared into the night. Sean stayed behind, his pulse hammering in his ears as the officers approached. He knew he couldn't outrun them, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The heist. 4 minutes of tension, precision, and the thrill of the score. The docks were eerily quiet, shrouded in a thick blanket of fog that muted the sounds of the city. The air smelled of salt and rust, the occasional creak of a crane adding to the tension. Ethan stood by a towering stack of shipping containers, adjusting the gloves on his hands. Gerald's crew moved with calculated precision, their movements efficient as they began cutting into the lock on a massive container marked with a nondescript logo. Sean leaned against the side of a van, his green eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of trouble. Bernie and Kurt worked the cutting tools, their rough banter a thin veil for their anxiety. Bernie, you ever think about what happens if we get caught? Kurt, I don't get caught. Ethan, enough chatter, let's get this done and get out of here. The lock gave way with a metallic snap, and the crew swung the doors open to reveal stacks of high-end electronics. Flat-screen TVs, gaming systems, and laptops, each box neatly packaged and gleaming under the dim light of the dock's floodlights. Gerald had chosen the target well. Ethan barked, "Move!" The crew sprang into action, loading the goods into 2 waiting vans. Each man worked swiftly, their breaths visible in the cold air, their muscles straining under the weight of the stolen items. The operation was running smoothly, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Halfway through the load, the sound of a distant engine made everyone freeze. Ethan's heart jumped, but it was only a passing cargo truck, its headlights cutting through the fog before disappearing into the night. Ethan commanded, "Keep going." The final box was loaded, and Ethan slammed the van's doors shut. "We're good, let's move," he said. Sean smirked, grabbing the keys to one of the vans. "I'll drive this one," Sean declared. Ethan hesitated. "You sure that's a good idea?" Sean insisted. "We don't have time for this. Let's go." Reluctantly, Ethan climbed into the passenger seat while Sean slid behind the wheel. The van's engine roared to life and they pulled out of the docks, the other van following close behind. The streets were quiet, but the tension in the van was palpable. Sean's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he navigated through the industrial district. Ethan advised, "Keep it steady, we don't need to draw any attention." Sean didn't respond, his jaw clenched as he focused on the road. The glow of the city lights grew brighter as they moved closer to the main thoroughfares, and for a moment, Ethan allowed himself to hope they might actually pull this off. Then the familiar flash of red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror. Ethan's stomach dropped as Sean muttered under his breath, "Damn it, not now." The patrol car closed in behind them, its siren wailing briefly before cutting off. Ethan ordered, "Pull over." Sean hesitated but nodded, easing the van to the side of the road. The officer stepped out, and as he approached, Ethan recognized him instantly. It was the same cop who had stopped Sean before. The officer's flashlight swept across the van's interior, pausing on Sean before moving to Ethan. His brow furrowed. "O'Connell, didn't expect to see you again so soon," the officer remarked. Sean forced a tight smile. "Just running some late-night errands, officer." The officer's eyes narrowed as he studied Ethan. "And you? You don't look like the errand-running type," he said. Ethan stayed silent, his heart pounding. The officer stepped back, his hand resting on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle, both of you," he ordered. Sean's face tightened, but he complied, opening the door and stepping onto the pavement. Ethan followed, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to remain calm. The officer's flashlight moved to the back of the van, illuminating the edges of the loaded boxes visible through the windows. "Pop the trunk," the officer demanded. Sean hesitated, and the officer's voice hardened. "Now!" With a resigned sigh, Sean pressed the button. The doors swung open, revealing the stolen electronics stacked neatly inside. The officer's face darkened, and he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup," he called. Sean's shoulders sagged as the gravity of the situation hit him. Ethan's chest tightened, his mind racing as he realized there was no talking their way out of this. Within minutes, more patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the street in harsh reds and blues. Sean and Ethan were cuffed and placed in separate vehicles, the stolen goods being unloaded as officers took inventory. As the van doors slammed shut, Ethan stared at his reflection in the metal partition, his mind a whirlwind of regret and disbelief. Sean sat in another car, his jaw clenched and his eyes burning with frustration. The night had started with the promise of a big score. Now it ended with the cold reality of their choices. Chapter 19. Reckoning. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation and the hum of whispered conversations. Cameras clicked incessantly as journalists jostled for the best angle. The trial of Ethan Brooks and Sean O'Connell had captured the nation's attention, the media branding it the ultimate tale of justice catching up to those who once wore the badge. The judge's gavel banged, silencing the room as the proceedings began. Ethan and Sean sat at the defense table, their expressions grim. Ethan's sharp blue eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his choices. Sean sat beside him, his face a mask of defiance, though his clenched fists betrayed the anxiety simmering beneath the surface. Both men were dressed in somber suits, but nothing could mask the fall from grace that had brought them here. As the prosecution laid out the case, the gallery listened intently. Evidence of their crimes was paraded before the court, the stolen electronics, the surveillance footage, and witness testimony. The damning evidence painted a picture of two former officers who had not only betrayed their badges, but had sunk deeply into the criminal world they were sworn to combat. When the verdict was read, the room was silent. "Guilty," the judge declared, his voice ringing out clearly. Ethan's chest tightened while Sean's jaw tensed visibly. Their sentences were harsh but expected. 3 years for Ethan, 4 for Sean, with no possibility of parole for either during the first half of their terms. The gavel struck again, sealing their fate. Across town, Alan Watts sat in his office, the glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the tall windows. The headline on his desk screamed, "Fallen officers sentenced for crimes, justice served." Alan's lips pressed into a thin line as he read through the article. The conviction had been swift, and the media frenzy surrounding the case had ensured that the public was watching. Picking up the phone, Alan dialed Jason. His brother's voice answered after a few rings, warm but cautious. "Alan, it's done. They're sentenced." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jason replied, "How do you feel about it?" Alan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Not happy, but I think the public needed this. They needed to see that the system can work, that those two weren't just bad cops, they were rotten to the core. It gives some closure. Closure for the public, maybe. For us?" Alan frowned, staring out the window at the bustling city below. "Maybe not full closure, but it's a step. They'll pay for what they did. I guess that's something." They spoke for a few more minutes before ending the call. Alan sat in silence for a while, his thoughts drifting to Gloria, who had been stoic throughout the ordeal. He knew the pain of it all would never truly fade, but perhaps now, with this verdict, the healing could begin. As the news spread, the public reaction was mixed. Some saw the convictions as a victory for accountability, while others saw them as a grim reminder of the corruption that could fester in institutions meant to uphold justice. The Watts family became a symbol of resilience, their voices a rallying cry for those demanding reform. In their cell blocks, Ethan and Sean adjusted to the stark reality of their new lives. Ethan spent his days replaying his choices, the regret a constant companion. Sean, though outwardly stoic, couldn't shake the bitterness of his downfall. Both men, once on opposite sides of the law, now shared the same fate, a slow, grinding march through a system they had once thought they controlled. The world moved on, but the story of their rise and fall lingered in the public consciousness. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the thin line between hero and villain, and the price of crossing it.
This concludes the audiobook The Other Side of the Law by Michael Liverpool. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more audiobooks, films, and web series. Be sure to click like and subscribe, and feel free to share and get in the comments. Have a wonderful rest of your day.